Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence. There seems to be more and more layers. It's a thicket. It's we got the tail end of the pandemic is still playing out in some ways. The prospect of another one. We got climate change. We've got biodiversity loss. We've got political turmoil. We have an information system that's kind of broken at the moment. And that's what Sustain What is mostly about. How do we navigate complexity, come out the other end with a little bit better off than where we were when we started? And this is a slippery kind of diversion from the tail end of the election and my work on climate, but it's all interrelated because the interface of policy, economics, and environmental futures is very much in the mix when you think about this particular creature, the American eel and its kin in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And Ellen Ruppel Shell, who has been for decades a deep diving journalist, is dug into the eel question, and we're going to ask, why eels matter. Uh, I'm in Maine. I live a few miles from kind of Eel Central here. There's a little Quonset hut in Ellsworth, 5 miles away from me. That is a place where the immature stage of the eels, the harvest of them is kind of funneled, brokered through this town and a couple other places. The future of eels is kind of represented here in Maine in a nascent eel farm. And this is all chronicled in Ellen's new book, Slippery Beast. It's great to have you here. Ellen is a half-time Maine resident, resident of the world, and has traveled far and wide for this book. And my old friend Chris Bowser from the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State in the Hudson Valley, with whom I've spoken about eels on this same show several years ago, is here to join as well. And you were just in Maine. We're going to talk about all of that in a couple seconds. So first of all, great to have you here, and it's exciting, and congratulations to see this book coming out, Ellen. But the first question I want to ask Ellen is, why eels? As a journalist, you've written about food, the sort of the science of food, the obesity question, labor, consumption, other things, and you've written this is just the books. You've written magazine articles and the like about countless things, and also at the Boston Globe. So, what got you to dive into this eel slippery question?
Well, that's a question that's asked of me quite often. In fact, just yesterday, I gave a talk, and that was the first question that was asked by the audience. And I usually say the short answer is I did not find eels, eels found me. So, as you mentioned, I live about half the year in Maine. During COVID, I lived through the year in Maine. And I have a place down on the mid coast, what we call the mid coast. And it was pretty battered by the weather. And so one year my husband and I hired a guy to help us fix up the house. His name in the book is Sam. It's not his real name. And if you read the book, you'll know why we had to use a pseudonym, but he's a real person. But in any case, we hired Sam to help us out. And it became clear pretty quickly that Sam was not an enthusiastic handyman. He used to not show up quite a bit. And then the days he did show up, he'd sometimes quit early and pad into my kitchen with a 4-pack of cider. And I'm a sucker for a good story. My husband is not. So this was usually when my husband was out of town. But Sam would come in with this cider, and we'd sit down and he'd talk. He'd tell me stories. He's a great storyteller. And often those stories were about his family, and in particular, his grandson, who he adored. And he wanted to save up enough money, he told me, to buy a boat and teach his grandson how to fish. So I said, Sam, you don't really love this handyman job, this home repair job. Why don't you get yourself a commercial fishing license to go with that boat and mix business with pleasure? And Sam said, I could do that. In fact, I used to do that, but not anymore, not with the eels. It's gotten too dangerous down by the river. I said, "What are you talking about, Sam? Are you afraid these eels are gonna bite you?" And Sam said, I'm not talking about the eels big enough to bite. I'm talking about the baby eels. Ever since the price of baby eels went through the roof, it's gotten they're guns down by the river. People are cutting each other's nets." And I said, "Sam, what do you mean? The price of eels has gone through the roof. What are you talking about? Baby eels. What are they worth?" He said about $2,500 a pound. So I obviously was stopped short by that. I had no idea. This is about 12 years ago that this happened, this encounter. And I was working on another book at the time, my book called The Job, and that was a very long process. I'm very interested about in economic justice and things like that, work-related questions. But this stayed in the back of my mind, and I started exploring the whole world of eels to see if there was a book in it. And of course, there was more than a book in it. It's a absolutely fascinating creature with an incredible natural history. The stories behind it were just amazing. And I never became what I call an eel person. I describe eel people in the book. They include people like Rachel Carson and a whole list of others, modern scientists, as well as scientists going all the way back to Aristotle. So I was never an eel person per se, but I got very, very absorbed by the story. And I think it's kind of an irresistible saga, an incredible animal.
Yeah, and before we move on with the contents of the book and your learning, Chris, you're one of the most enthusiastic eel people I know, or naturalists I know. You just exude enthusiasm when you're out in the river, the Hudson River or its tributaries, with kids seining for the babies and trying to understand better their life cycle and how to protect them. So what the hell got you into this morass?
So I just have to say, I do find eels, and when we talk about eels, by the way, I think for today's program, right, eels encompasses a lot of things.
Yeah.
People start to talk about electric eels, which are only found in freshwaters of South America and are more closely related to catfish than actual real eels.
Right.
People think about moray eels that they've seen in documentaries or on Disney movies. We're talking about a group of super special animals called
Right.
the anguillids. And even that alone is a great word. So
Right.
these anguillid eels spend part of their lives in saltwater. Many of them move up into freshwater and then end their lives back in saltwater. And they're distributed throughout the world. And
Right.
they are, to me, the closest thing to magic that I have found on Earth. Their very life cycle is amazing. So here is a sadly preserved. This is what, I don't know if you can see it in there.
Here, let me make you bigger here. Hold on a second.
This is what an eel looks like when it's only a few weeks old. This is what's called a leptocephaly. And it kind of looks like a little willow leaf, or a friend of mine unceremoniously described it as a toenail clipping. But this is you can't really see it, but if you could zoom way in, you would actually see incredibly large, sharp teeth for this tiny animal. And this is the stage of the eel that is drifting, swimming through the ocean currents along the Gulf Stream from where it hatches, presumably in the Sargasso Sea. We don't actually know this for sure, which is part of the beauty of it.
Absolutely.
Then eventually we'll get, and here we have a lovely little, let me just grab this right. Here we have a lovely little live eel. So this is an eel. This is what we would call a glass eel. I'm sorry, I have to keep moving this.
No, this is fine.
Has just transformed into what we would call an elver.
Yeah.
Where it's got this pigment. It's starting to look like the miniature version of what it will look like for the rest of its life. But it's still, this is a pretty small one. So this was definitely a glass eel this spring, and is only now transitioning into the elver. Even its tail has that odd kind of little diamond shape to it.
Right.
So this is just a beautiful critter, and we see these eels come in the spring. And one of the things that's been really magical about the work that I get to do is that as I work with a lot of different students, I work with community volunteers, I work on a community science project where we're doing two things. One is we're looking at eels, we're monitoring eels, we're trying to count how many are coming into the Hudson, when and where every spring. But at the same time, we're also building a group of people who are not just passionate about eels, but use eels to discover the Hudson, use eels to discover the interrelations between freshwaters and saltwaters, use eels to maybe even engage in future careers or pathways that those young people or old people may want to take. So I love eels for eels' sake, but I also love them as an ambassador for learning about our lovely, lovely planet.
That's pretty great. And Ellen, the book runs through as a big section on the biology and the mystery. And then let's get into these sort of the gastronomy, because for untold history, humans have eaten all kinds of fish, including eels. As you mentioned, there were eel farms that Aristotle, I think, described in your book, right?
Yes.
So one reason people are interested in them is to eat them, not just they're a gateway drug to the wonders of conservation biology. Can you talk about that aspect? Because that's the pull, that's the economy of eels.
Absolutely. And first of all, Chris, that was a wonderful introduction to eels with the visuals, just terrific. But second of all, yes, when you talk about a gateway drug and the gastronomic aspects of eels, many people call eels a gateway drug to sushi, right?
Mhm.
Because we eat eels cooked. It was long thought. I mean, eating raw eels is considered poisonous. Now that's controversial because the human digestive tract denatures the protein that is the poison in eels. So technically it may not may not be poisonous, but I'm not advising people to be drinking a lot of eel blood. But so the history of eels is a culinary history, and you mentioned Aristotle. Eels were not only revered as a food, but they were revered in a lot of other ways, including the ancient Romans. Some of them had eels as pets. Okay, they actually adorned eels with jewelry. I mean, it was really there was a worship of eels in some places. But part of that had to do with the fact that it's a very, very nutritious food, right? And it's ubiquitous. There were so many eels that in some cultures, like in the North America, the Native Americans, the the Native Americans that lived in Canada and New England really relied on eel as a primary food through the winters because you could salt them. They're very fatty and nutritious, and you could salt them and smoke them and preserve them through those winters. So it was a very, very important food for Native Americans. But also in the colonies, it was also an important food. People came over from Europe, in England, where eels were a popular dish. Some of us still see eel pie and things like that in England. And so eel was it was for until about 1900s. Eel was considered a delicacy, and it was preferred over lobster, if you can believe it, up in New
No,
England. So
I can't.
it's got quite a history. And then, of course, when the popularity of sushi in the 1960s going forward, as I mentioned, eel was kind of the gateway drug to sushi because gateway food, I should say, to
Right,
sushi because you cook it, right? And people were
right.
squeamish. It's hard to remember this, but people were quite squeamish about eating raw fish, but they would eat eel. Okay, so uh, all that I'm addressing your
Yeah.
question about gastronomy. Yes.
And it adds up to close to a $5 billion global trade. Not just not just the American eel. I think that's European, Japanese eel, etc.
Well, I think it's quite a bit more than that, actually.
Yeah.
What I mentioned in the book is it's a $4 billion illicit trade
Oh,
in
that's
eel.
just the illicit trade.
That's just the illicit trade in eel, the black market in eel. It's the biggest, by dollar, it's the biggest wildlife crime in the world, the illegal trade in baby eels. It's just phenomenal. And by the way, it's getting worse.
Yeah.
Last year was considered one of the worst years in terms of illegal eel trade in history. So, yeah, the eel is very much under threat by the cartels, the illegal trading in baby eels. And as I mentioned, at that $2,500 a pound, just on that's the river price a couple of years ago in Maine. It's a lot more once it's off the river and it's gone through the middle people,
Mhm.
middlemen. Um, it's quite a big business. Yeah.
Yeah, and Chris, back in New York State, you're a DEC, and I don't think. Well, is there much of the illegal work there that's has to be kept track of, or is it more? Is it more other places?
So for our work in the Hudson Valley, we are really careful about this, and I think that we've got a really good system. We've got a good relationship with the property owners that we sample at. We've got a good relationship with the Department of Environmental Conservation, law enforcement people, and also remember, we're doing this for science and for monitoring. So the gear that we are using is going to be a lot smaller than a commercial fisherman would use.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not talking about your educational projects.
Yeah.
Just the wider issue of regulation and
It is something that we're always aware of,
Yeah.
and that we're always paying attention to. But knock on wood, we've been real fortunate not to have a lot of run-ins, at least in the regions that I work within. We've been really fortunate about that. But we're aware, and we talk to other states and other experts, and we're always paying attention to what's going on with that.
Yeah. So Ellen, getting back to this trade, it's I've covered. Oh my God, I can't remember how many species that have this issue, like caviar and sturgeon, the vaquita porpoises in Mexico that are being driven to extinction by the trade, and in the swim bladder of a fish that's also endangered, the totoaba, and here's the eel, which has this bizarre reality that, and I think we should get back to it, the question of the mystery. It's not like we're just getting to the point where you can start to think about farming them from scratch, but they have to be caught live as this little baby creature, and then that's what's smuggled, right? Could you just talk through the part of the book that's about that, and maybe we can get into some of the characters, as I say, I've broken down. You have various eel personalities. These are little excerpts from your book. The eel godfather, who's like the and some of them, they're not all. This is not all bad people. It's
No.
just interesting, passionate people who are involved in this stuff. But let's get into this trade more. How does a baby an eel at this stage get to an Asian smuggling chain and onward from there?
Okay, so a very good question, and you're absolutely right about the other species that are illegally traded. The case of the eel is special in some sense because we cannot breed the American or the European eel in captivity. We
Right.
cannot. They will not do it. And there have been noble attempts, as is close to my home. I live in, as I said, in Maine, but also in Massachusetts. University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, there was a scientist who worked very, very hard to try to breed an American eel in captivity. He succeeded in actually doing it, but the larva died almost instantly. And he's given up because he has no more funding. There's not a lot of funding for this creature in the United States. There's a lot more in Japan and in Europe than there is in the United States.
Because
But in any
that's where the demand is, right?
because that's where yes.
Yeah.
And so in the case of the American eel in particular, as you indicated, as Chris has shown us, the life cycle is really, incredible, right? As it is thought that they breed. Now it's thought that they breed in the Sargasso Sea. Again, that's controversial. No, it's not 100%, but there's a lot of strong evidence. And I went to the Sargasso Sea. I went to talk to scientists who embarked on an expedition just this past year to look for eel eggs and to see if they could actually confirm this theory. They were unable to do this after a month at sea. It's really it's like an unbelievable story that today we still don't know for sure that they breed in the Sargasso Sea, but it is thought that they do. And so this incredible migration, in the case of the American eel, up the east coast of the United States, and some go as far away, far north as Greenland. Um, it takes over a year to do this. These little tiny larvae, battling the seas, battling predators. Very few make it to the coast, where they then go up in estuaries and, as Chris pointed out to ponds and lakes in some cases, and hang out for as much as 40 years before returning.
Oh,
That's right.
Yeah.
And they're returned back to the Sargasso Sea as silver eels. That's the final stage. They're sexually mature eels. At that point, they don't eat the entire trip back to the Sargasso. They live on their own bodies. By the time they get back to the Sargasso, they're a husk. There's virtually nothing left of them. And then they breed once or maybe twice, we're not sure, and die. So they only breed once in a life cycle, right? So these things are incredibly vulnerable, whether to freshwater conditions or saltwater conditions. They're very, very vulnerable. And that helps explain why they've declined to such a great degree in Europe and in the United States. So the illegal trade, because you cannot breed them in captivity, you're right, Andrew, that you have to start them as baby eels. And in the US and Canada, they are not grown up in this country by and large. They are grown up to market size in China.
Right.
So they're caught in the case of Maine eels, Maine has the only significant baby eel fishery in the United States. They are caught in Maine and then shipped to China. Again, a perilous journey, and grown up on eel farms. There are about 1,000 eel farms in China. And then they're shipped back to the United States for consumption, largely in sushi restaurants or sushi platters at grocery stores. So again, because the source of eels is so imperiled and rarefied, they are quite costly and valuable, and because of that, they are the target of an awful lot of international crime.
Is it possible? We're going to talk more about solutions toward the end, including the farm in Maine. But I was wondering just now, has DNA tracking, is there a certification process here possible, like there is for some other biological stuff that's valuable?
Yes.
If it's so, how is that? I can't remember if that's in the book.
Yes.
I was trying to.
It is in the book, and there was a paper out last year that did test eel in the United States. They found an awful lot of contraband eel, European eel, which shouldn't have been here in grocery stores and restaurants. It's illegal to export European eel out of the EU. And despite that, there's quite a bit of European eel in the United States. And also in China, we know for a fact that there is an awful lot of contraband American eel in China that should not be in China. Right now, the largest exporter of American eel by far is thought to be Haiti. Okay,
Really?
so yes, so the habitat of the American eel does extend to the Caribbean, and Haiti is deep into the illicit elver market. Yeah, and they're exporting what some scientists reported last year was 100 tons of American elvers to China last year, which is phenomenal because you have to think the entire quota in Maine for the entire state of Maine is less than 10,000 pounds a year. So the idea that 100 tons was exported to China just from Haiti, and
Right.
they claim that is true. And I had this confirmed as recently as last week. Okay, because I didn't believe it. I didn't. And I even in the book, I said, I don't know, but this is what, this is what scientists say. Last week, it was confirmed to me. So enormous amounts. And that definitely endangers the American eel, which is already down by 50% and will obviously is being further endangered by this illegal trade in eels, which is quite
Right.
quite frightening, actually, in many regards. Lives have been lost. The Canadian fishery closed last year entirely. The Canadian elver fishery closed in part because of violence and criminality in Canada. So it's gotten to be kind of the wild, wild west again with the eel trade.
Boy, and the data on this is the juvenile eel sort of tracking. This sort of ends around 20, quite a while ago. Is one study I found that shows, actually, I got to tell you, looking at that graph reminds me of the American sturgeon. It had this similar plunge. And
This is sadly like, right, this is sort of a similar graph that you see actually with a lot of fisheries. So sort of a classic example of fisheries management. And even if you took this back, I mean, this goes back to 1950. Even if you took this back to 1900s, with the advent of so many of diesel engines, of better fishing line materials, polypropylene and things like that, the 20th century was really a century where we human beings, boy, we really perfected how to catch fish. We got into it and we got good at it. And so you start to see this not just with eels, but with a lot of other species as well throughout the ocean and our rivers. And so so one thing for listeners to look at if they want to find out more about management of species is to look up something called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I know that's a long word, and it's an acronym of ASMFC, which is also sort of a hard to remember. But that's a website that can actually, species by species, walk you through some of what interstate management is doing, is looking like for lots of different species, including the American eel. So that's I bring that up in case anybody's looking to do a really deep dive. You can spend forever on eel management or any other species management on the ASMFC's websites.
I'll hold on a second. I'm going to actually plunk that into the public chat so people can go there. Ellen, obviously people should read the book, and it's just Google for slippery beast and Ellen Shell, Shell, and you'll find it. But have you found in tracking the issues and options some other good sources? Or the New Yorker did an interesting piece. There's been some documentaries about this stuff. What else crosses your mind as something for people to
well, I do know that the BBC, for example, is working on a documentary right now, an investigative documentary to deal with the illicit trade in eels. There's a Dutch filmmaker, Hans Dortman, who has a new film out, a documentary film on the science and actually some of the culture around the eel, and it's premiering in Europe, and I'm hoping it's coming to the United States. There are obviously, scientific papers on eels that I'm not sure how many of your listeners be interested in, but it's in the United States, it's an under-considered creature, right? As one European scientist said to me, "You Americans don't give a damn about eels," and I said, "That's kind of true." So the reason we should, maybe beyond the fact that they're adorable and there are many good things about the eel. extinctions of animals is kind of, the engine of evolution. And we've got to expect that many animals have gone extinct and many more will go extinct. I mean, that's part of the ebb and flow of life, right?
Right.
But the eel is special in that it is a very, very ancient creature. I mean, it predated the dinosaurs by many, many, many millions of years. It's like it's kind of a foundational creature in nature's plan, right? So nature kind of built a lot of habitats under the assumption that there would be eels, right? So I actually just wrote an op-ed, an opinion piece, what they call an ideas piece for the Boston Globe that's out today
Oh,
about why the eel is so foundational and how, unfortunately, I'm going to take maybe be a little bold here and talk about how some of the Trump policies really endangered not only the eel, but all endangered species by its threat to habitats, right? So,
yeah.
Project 2025 and things like that. I mean, I'm
Well,
sure that,
it's
right,
expressly in Project 2025 to deregulate and the fisheries, federal fisheries budgets and the like. So it's not a
exactly.
sideshow. It's part of this. You got the biology, you got the economy, and then you got the politics, and you can't take that
Right.
off.
And so I use the eel simply as an example of a species that is an indicator species, right? And so if it starts to decline radically in a waterway, it threatens all sorts of other things that go on in that waterway. In the case of the eel, the classic example is in the Susquehanna River. When eels became almost gone from that river, the freshwater mussel,
Whoops.
I
the
think she
the
just
lack of the eel, right? So
you just
because
you just
sorry,
froze for a second. Can you just repeat that the muscle point?
sure. So when the Susquehanna River, due to dams, there are 4 major dams on
Right.
that river, it pulverized the eels, it killed them, and made it impossible for them to migrate. And when that happened, the freshwater mussel was threatened because the eel is kind of an Uber for freshwater mussel larvae. Right? So these little freshwater mussel larvae attached to the eel and are distributed by the eel. Well, when the eel was blown out, the mussels were blown out. When the mussels were blown out, they're filter feeders. They detoxify the river and take out pollutants. And when the freshwater mussel was obliterated, the
Yeah.
Susquehanna become more and more polluted. So it's not just the eel itself, right? It's because the eel is so foundational. This is not true of every species. It's really foundational to these waterways, both freshwater and, but especially freshwater, I should say. They are in, they breed in salt water, but they're not, really necessarily significant animal in saltwater, but they're very significant animal in freshwater. You can do a lot of damage to a river very quickly if you eliminate eels, right?
Well,
So
Chris, yeah,
that's the argument.
yeah, and Chris, I'm sure that's part of the educational opportunity. Getting back to that gateway, it's a gateway to complexity.
Well, we get this question all the time of like, why eels? And, I can talk about, they're fun for me, but
Right.
Ecologically speaking, right? I mean, think about these little glass eels or these little elvers. They come into these Hudson River tributaries in the spring at a time where, the river and the ecosystem has not really warmed up, energetically speaking, from a long cold winter. And here come these lovely Sargasso flavored snacks coming in by the hundreds of thousands into the estuary. And it's like, wow, what a wonderful food source. Then at the same time, if you go up into these headwaters, or there's John Castleman has done some great studies of the history of eels in, like, let's say, big systems like the Great Lakes. Eels can be major top apex predators in the freshwater river world. So
Right.
eels are intersecting with the whole ecosystem, from the coast to the estuary to the stream, from little babies as food to top predators that are eating and controlling other things. In some cases, introduced species like rusty crayfish, things like that. So eels are having an active role in their ecosystem at all stages of their lives.
Right.
And the other great thing about eels is they can really be symbols of river recovery. The Susquehanna is a great example, and some of the work that's being done there to trap and pass eels above dams so that those mussel populations can rebound. But we've mentioned dams now a couple of times.
Right.
And one of the movements that is slow but growing is the idea of removing dams when they're either anachronistic, they're maybe no longer fulfilling the purpose they were originally fulfilled for, or in cases where those dams are still, kind of a vital, necessary part of the human ecosystem, providing some sort of fish passage above, around, or through those dams. So that becomes a way, eels become this symbol of river reconnectivity. And they take with them, when you restore a river for eels, you're not just restoring them for eels, you're restoring them for a whole host of other animals that also rely on river connectivity. You could kind of call them an umbrella species almost.
Yeah.
If you use eels as your target for management, they bring with them a whole ecosystem with them. So, let's look at dams, let's look at water quality, let's look at habitats. And when you do that, so many other things come with them. And that's part of the messages that we try to get into when we're working with students. One of the subtleties to kind of bend a little bit with eels and talking about fish and food is that a lot of times when we disconnect with an animal as a food source, we might also run the risk of disconnecting with that animal altogether.
Yeah.
So I think about the Hudson River, and I think about shad fishing on the Hudson River. When I first started 25 years ago on the Hudson, I was so proud and honored to go out with commercial shad fishermen and actually spend days on the water catching these fish and seeing what they learned. And then when that shad fishery closed, and for understandable conservation reasons it closed, those commercial fishermen had to hang up their nets.
Yeah,
Will we get that back? I don't know, because if we stop caring about an animal or stop thinking about an animal as a part of our ecosystem, we may not get angry about it. A few generations later, it may never even occur to people that this is an animal that they have a relationship with. So one of the things that we try to do with the Eel Project is to build those relationships. And right now in New York, it's not a relationship that can be built on eels as food. So in the absence of that, we're trying to still build a relationship with people about eels as a way to learn about science, and as an ambassador to greater ecosystem health and everything that brings, not just to animals, but to people as well.
So I'd like to get back into the book, and you something you just mentioned gets to the solutions question. The book is a marvelous read. It's kind of like this whole discussion. It's a prismatic look with narrative tales through it at these many dimensions of this challenge that this species poses. It goes way beyond the individual animal to, as Chris was saying, the full sweep of conservation and our relationship to the thing we call nature, meaning non-human stuff. Of course, we're part of nature. I want to fast forward here to the book. One thing I want to ask you before we get into some solutions, Ellen, is what's the key takeaway? Which is a silly question, but it's always asked. Along with being a great story and an important question, what can change people's way of thinking that's in here, and what have you built here that you hope people can carry away beyond a good read? Oh, maybe did you freeze? I think maybe she's froze again. Well, wait a second. Okay, we're going to get back to her. The book does have a big section on something I think Chris were just in Maine. Oh, she's coming back on. Yeah, hold on. I see her coming. Hold on.
Ah,
I'll get rid of the frozen you. Remove from stage. There we go. Somehow can you hear us? Oh, she froze again. I'm not sure what's happening, but I'll tell you, the book has a really interesting section on possible paths toward different relationships with this species. And Chris, I know you've read the book and you've been to Maine recently. There's a young woman down toward the other end of Maine from where I am, who's trying an experiment and has significant support from federal government and elsewhere and investors. Chris, what do you know about this project? American unagi. Oh, Chris, I think you're muted.
I think what you're referring to is American unagi.
That is it.
Which is an eel aquaculture facility in Waldoboro, Maine, that is run by this wonderful person here, Sarah Rademacher, and an excellent staff. But I think Ellen is back, and maybe Ellen was getting ready to speak on that. I don't want to steal that section from her.
Yeah. Well, again, Ellen, I was asking about this key question. What's a key thing you want people to take away from the book, other than just sort of anecdotal things to share with people? Like, is there a different way of thinking about conservation or how people relate to their food that you think you really want to convey?
And then one of the things I don't want to do is discourage people from eating eel, okay? Because as you know, scientists have told me, and they're absolutely right, if we stop eating it, we stop caring about it, right? And that's absolutely right, Chris. Absolutely true. Sarah Rademacher is, as Chris mentioned, is a aquaculturalist. She's trained in aquaculture. She's originally from Indiana. Very far from Maine, but adopted the state of Maine and has built the first commercially viable eel farm in the United States. There have been others, but hers is really the one that has managed to succeed up to a point. It's only 2 years old. We'll see how it goes. It's American unagi. And what she's trying to do is to short circuit that crazy supply chain, this method of, this process of sending eel to China to grow up on eel farms of questionable quality, right? We don't really know what's going on in those eel farms in China. We presume, for example, that they use hormones to grow their eels, not necessarily a good thing. So she's trying to do it in Maine and hopes to grow about 6% of the American supply of eel each year and distribute it. Hopefully that'll happen. She's off to a good start. Her eel is not priced at a price point that many people would necessarily be willing to pay, but it's available at some at restaurants, and it's available in retail shops. So this is the first foray into commercial eel fishing, and there's another one going on. Native Americans, Passamaquoddy tribe, is trying to get started on their own aquaculture effort in a different part of Maine, Princeton, Maine, a part of Maine that not many people go to or see. It's not a fashionable part of Maine. It's a more hardscrabble area that they're hoping will bring some economic benefit. So yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
it's a very, very difficult thing to do, though, especially without hormones. Okay, because in captivity, eels tend to skew male. Okay, one of the interesting things about eels is their gender is determined by the environment, not necessarily by genes. And in very crowded conditions, they tend to be male. So most eel farms are very crowded. And so there are many more males, and males are slow growing compared to females. So growing them without hormones is really a challenge. Okay, so if they're allowed as they are allowed in China, hormones are allowed, it makes it much more financially viable to grow them. So the challenges in the United States and Canada, which also does not have eel farms, are significant. Right. So it's a big challenge, but one that's certainly worth taking.
So there's a question that came in from Doug Grant. He rarely eats large fish because of the accumulation of pollutants, and he's worried that eels low in the food. Well, set aside where they are in the food chain, but their longevity must have some impact on pollutant accumulation.
Well, that's one of the reasons why, for example, state agencies like the Department of Environmental Conservation, but you could take any state agency, fisheries rules and such are not just determined by populations. We often look, for example, here in New York State, the Department of Health looks a lot at legacy pollutants or persistent pollutants like PCBs. That's a fairly well-known one.
Yep.
And there are some pretty strong regulations about where it's considered safe or not safe to eat fish, as well as what species are considered safer than others, in part because of some of what Doug's getting at. That can be longevity, where you are in the food chain, fat content. One of the interesting things about eels, particularly in an aquaculture facility like American unagi, is that those eels are living in the sort of wild river habitat for a very short amount of time, and then they're in a much more controlled environment with recirculated water or water pumped up from wells. That those wells can be relatively easily tested compared to a river system. So some of those concerns that Doug is getting at are allayed by an aquaculture facility. That's if
Right.
an aquaculture facility is done right, that's one of the big benefits of it.
Well, Chris is absolutely right. To address Doug's question directly, he's absolutely right. Eels are very fatty and they're bioaccumulators, right? And they can hang out in a lake or a river for a very long time, certainly for 10 years, not a problem at all. In the case of a female eel, and sometimes it's the oldest eels are thought to be as much as 80 years old. Okay. So they, we're not sure about that, but we're sure that they can hang around for 40 years and they will accumulate toxins in their fat. He's absolutely right. So we do have to be really conscious. Most eel eaten the world over is not caught in the wild. It is cultivated eel, right? And so part of the reason for that is eel caught in the wild doesn't taste good, partly because it is bioaccumulating toxins and other flavors that people don't like. So yeah, sure. An eel caught in a pristine, clean waterway would probably be just great, but there aren't that many of those left, right? So Doug is right. And eating wild eel is a real crapshoot. Okay. That's not one that I would take. And we do have a lake next to my home in Maine with eels in it. And no way would I eat an eel caught in that lake. Okay.
Yeah. So there's one last question I want to bring up that I just was doing some research on this morning and preparing for the show, and I don't think it's in the book. This gets to Chris's point about our attachment to an understanding of and getting a deeper appreciation for the things that we consume. So the supply chain, just knowing where that shrimp came from. My students and I, a long time ago at Pace University, did a documentary on shrimp farming. And we went to Belize, where an American woman and her Belizean counterparts were doing fantastic low impact shrimp farming. The water doesn't flow out into the environment. They just move it from one pool to the next, etc. And she had some local markets, but when you look at the global massive trade, and there's still no way, you don't go to the market and look at a frozen bag of shrimp and know, it's almost impossible to find, even at Whole Foods, oh, these shrimp came from this farm, and etc. And you have to have a consumer who cares about it. So I love that idea of education for understanding and complexity. But I also I'm intrigued by this kind of thing too. 4C is this company in Israel that's now cultivating eel flesh and selling. They're going to be starting to sell cultured unagi. So theoretically, depending on what their inputs and outputs are, just for the energy, the substances to make the tissue grow, could be another route to conservation by detaching us from nature. So I don't know how that might fit in. I've actually written about this in the context of meat, beef and the like. And so I wonder whether 50 years from now, if you had your own picture in the head of what success for our relationship with eels would look like, how much of it's about, let's say, DNA certification of existing eel trade? How much of it's about other aspects of what has to happen, consumer education? How much of it's about technology and maybe detaching from eels? I'd like to get from you, each of you, sort of a thought about that. What's that look like 50 years from now? And I think we're mostly not going to be around unless you're really lucky.
So I could address that if first, if Chris would allow it. I certainly knew about this effort in Israel, and I was in Israel, and I knew about this effort. But Andrew, the implicit quandary that you raised is, if we do this, will we lose our interest in the eel? And I think the answer is yes. Okay, eels are not charismatic. They are very scary to a lot of people because they look like snakes, right? And so the idea that we're going to sustain eels and when we're no longer eating them is a big question. So it's not just obviously the illicit trade in eels; it's also the kinds of things that Chris was talking about, the dams and the other damage that we can do to these ecosystems, to these habitats, right? So if we have this as an option, hey, great, Mazel Tov. I'm very excited about this, cell culture unagi. But on the other hand, I'm not sure it's if you're a conservationist, this should be your priority. Okay, maybe if you're a gastronome, and you want to eat eel, and you want to eat it with a clear conscience, this is a great option. And I'm not diminishing it at all. And eel is very expensive. This is potentially a way to make it less expensive, although yet at this point it's not less expensive.
No, it still gets expensive.
It's expensive. But okay. But like all cultured foods, right? Now, if you've got a domesticated animal like a cow, it's less concerning to have the artificial option. But with a wild animal embedded in an indicator species for all these habitats, I'm probably less enthusiastic from a conservation standpoint.
I get that. Yeah. So, Chris, what's your thinking? Looking ahead with all these kids energized and some of them going into conservation biology, but with the global market that's so big, and what would that picture look like for you?
So I have a dream. Why do I do what I do? I have a dream, and it is a dream that will not happen in my lifetime and may never happen, right? In my dream world, a family in Poughkeepsie, New York, goes down to the Hudson River, catches fish out of the river, and eats it at a family barbecue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are so many parts of that are not going to happen soon or ever. But that dream incorporates so many good things. If that image was ever to happen, it would mean healthy habitats with no pollutants and healthy fish stocks that are regulated in a way. It also means access, like people can actually get to the river and know about what's going on. So I understand that is a very Pollyanna vision, but I like having it in my head because it helps guide me. I don't know much about cell-cultured unagi or any other food projects, but I do really like what I see, both in terms of community education, but also some of these diversified approaches to eels and eating eels. I'll just give a couple of really, really super short examples. Take my DEC hat off for a second yet. I was on vacation. When I go on vacation, by the way, I find eels. That's what I do on vacation, people. That's when you know you're in love with eels. So I was in Comacchio, Italy, a month ago, and I happened to be there in time to go to an eel festival there at the Museo di Marinata, which is in Comacchio. They have a lagoon that is basically a natural wetland that over the last 1,000 years has been slowly shaped and crafted to be this perfect, almost nature-based eel aquaculture facility that's semi-wild. and they celebrate this long, long history with the European eel there. Just a few weekends a year. It is not an overblown, massive commercial fishery or anything like that. It is a very close community-based festival that I was so honored to be a part of. And so when I see things like that, I think to myself, maybe there are ways to think about eating eels, fishing eels, farming eels in a very, very diverse setting. I absolutely I absolutely love what I've seen Sarah and American Unagi doing. And I've talked with her and her staff about how they want to build community education into what they're doing. And I don't think in their case, it's not just a greenwashing a commercial product.
No.
Because I think in a case like that, they're working with local commercial fishermen, with local businesses that might want their product, with local families that are tied into this history with eels. So I think in an operation like that, we can't always separate commercial interests or gastronomic interests from ecological interests. In some cases, some have to take priority, we need to get it, in something like a sturgeon, for example, we are not at a place where we can start thinking about harvesting sturgeon. No. But when we have fisheries where alternate efforts might be interesting as tools of conservation, I think we need to explore those. So I think it's great that if gene cultured, cell cultured eels is a part of that, maybe that's a great thing. But in the meantime, I'm really loving what I'm seeing domestically here in the United States doing, from Maine with their sort of closed circuit, domestic, locally based aquaculture, to what we have going on here in New York, where we're trying to really engage community science, and how some of those efforts might build out into other states, with how we're looking at dam removal, right-sizing culverts, reconnecting rivers. I published an article with my wonderful collaborator, Dr. Christy Leora Gansworth, about how eels can be a symbol of reconnection. And Dr. Gansworth comes at this from her research as an indigenous Anishinaabe woman who is looking at eels as a hugely important part of indigenous cultures in the Northeast. There are so many good news stories about eels that I really, really love it. And, when we look at our little buddy here, and I know, eels can be so calm and collected. And this little eel here, who, by the way, wants nothing more than to get back under its gravel and its rocks to hide. And fear not, as soon as this program is over, this eel will go right back to the mud. I just am very, very hopeful for eels, and I'm very, very hopeful that people are a part of this eel story and not in opposition to the eel story.
Wow. Well, I think this has been a great conversation, and I should probably do a follow-up one with Sarah from American Unagi, and maybe the people at 4C in Israel to kind of explore what will ultimately be a many-stranded future for these creatures and for humanity.
It's a good idea.
Technology and tradition. So many areas I've looked at. You need both. You need all of this stuff. Same thing with agriculture, over and over. Thanks so much, Chris Bowser, New York State DEC educator extraordinaire. Ellen Ruppel Shell, author extraordinaire, about your book Slippery Beast, has stimulated this chat. And that's it for this episode of Sustain What, through which I seek pathways to progress through complex and consequential moments in time, which is where we're at. And everybody, please make sure you vote, call friends who are in swing states, whatever you're thinking, and make sure we have full participation in what's happening this coming week and beyond. So thanks, and we'll do more on this, okay? Take care. Hold on one second.